The conference room was suffocating. I sat at the polished glass table, watching Victoria Thorne adjust her tablet with a series of impatient manicured taps. The air felt heavy, smelling faintly of expensive perfume, stale coffee, and cheap corporate panic. Without looking up, she slid the white termination packet across the reflective surface. It stopped inches from my hands. She told me that my director had convinced her I was no longer essential. She said they were restructuring. Her voice was flat, clipped, and completely devoid of any warmth. My stomach tightened, a familiar cold knot forming in my gut. 24 years. I had spent 24 years of my life building this company from a chaotic startup in a damp warehouse into a regional powerhouse. I had designed every inch of their digital infrastructure, laid the physical fiber optic cables, built the database protocols, and protected their data. Now all that history, all that dedication and late-night labor was reduced to a 30-minute exit window. Julian Miller stood near the whiteboard, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, leaning against the wall. A smug, insufferable grin played on his lips. I knew that look. Julian had been gunning for my position since the moment he was hired as technology director 5 years ago. He was a traditionalist, a man who believed technology was a machine to be driven until it broke, rather than a living system to be nurtured and understood. To Julian, an experienced architect who understood complex code he could not hope to comprehend was a direct threat to his fragile, expensive ego. Victoria finally looked up at me, her eyebrow raised in a silent, annoying demand for me to pack up and leave. I kept my voice steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crack. I asked them who would be managing the adaptive cycling protocol once I was gone. Julian stepped forward, his tone dripping with arrogance. He told me they were implementing an always-on architecture, calling my cycling system inefficient and outdated. He claimed modern systems did not need rest periods, waving his hand as if dismissing a child. I nodded slowly, keeping my thoughts to myself. I had designed their entire server network using biomimetic principles, mimicking natural biological patterns. Just like human muscles, these servers required structured periods of reduced load to rest and recover. It was not a defect. It was a deliberate, highly efficient design choice. My approach allowed the servers to use 35% less energy and resulted in 65% fewer hardware failures, compared to the industry standard. But to executives like Victoria and Julian, who viewed technology as a collection of tireless iron horses, my method looked like waste. I stood up, smoothing down my jacket. I wished them luck. Victoria, already looking back at her screen, told me that security would meet me at my desk. As I turned to leave, Julian muttered that I should have stayed in my lane, a final petty jibe. The security guard stood awkwardly by my desk as I methodically packed my belongings. I placed my small desk plant, my favorite ceramic coffee mug, and the framed photo of my son, Toby, into a cardboard box. I did not delete a single file. I did not change any passwords or alter any core configurations. I simply house-gathered what was mine and walked out of the building with my head held high, ignoring the averted eyes of my former co-workers. They were too afraid of Victoria's new regime to offer any words of comfort. When I arrived at my quiet home, I set the box down, kicked off my shoes, and poured myself a glass of red wine. I sat by the window, watching the rain drizzle against the glass. The adaptive cycling protocol was scheduled to trigger automatically at midnight, shifting the massive processing loads and allowing the server clusters to cool down. But Julian had overridden it, forcing the machines to run at maximum capacity. I knew exactly what was coming. At exactly 2:45 in the morning, my phone began to vibrate violently on the nightstand. I looked at the screen. I had 9 missed calls and 15 urgent text messages. The messages were frantic, filled with desperate accounts of system crashes, database errors, and rising temperatures. I ignored them, took a slow sip of my wine, and waited. By 3:30 in the morning, Julian called me directly. His voice was frantic, his usual smugness replaced by high-pitched desperation. He demanded to know what I had done to the system, his words slurring slightly in his panic. I smiled, listening to the hum of the quiet night. As I sat in that quiet room, my mind raced back to the early days, when the company was just 3 people and a server held together by duct tape. I had believed in a vision of sustainable technology. I had worked through holidays, and missed family dinners, convinced that we were building something meaningful. Victoria, with her expensive business degree and spreadsheets, saw none of that. To her, history was just a line item to be depreciated. She did not understand the hours of sweat built into the bedrock of this firm. She only saw the numbers on her screen, numbers that Julian had manipulated to serve his own career goals. Julian had arrived with a lot of noise, promising to modernize our processes by replacing experienced staff with cheaper, outsourced labor. He had targeted me from the start because I refused to smile at his buzzwords. I had stood my ground in every meeting, pointing out that his proposed changes would compromise our security and double our energy usage. Now they were cutting me loose, thinking they could run my machine without the mechanic. They would learn, soon enough, that some architectures cannot be automated or managed by a spreadsheet. I listened to the frantic, shallow breathing on the other end of the line, keeping my own voice completely calm. I told Julian that I had done absolutely nothing, and that was precisely the problem. He sputtered, threatening to sue me into oblivion if I did not fix the servers immediately. I asked him on what grounds he would sue me. I reminded him that I had designed a system that worked flawlessly for years until he decided to break it. I told him those servers were calibrated for load cycling, and that running them continuously at maximum capacity would inevitably overheat the delicate hardware. He yelled that it was sabotage, but I corrected him, stating it was simply thermodynamics. I advised him to check the detailed maintenance logs I had left behind, though I knew he had never bothered to read them. 4 more hours passed in silence. At 7 in the morning, Victoria called me herself. The clinical efficiency in her voice was gone, replaced by a tense, barely controlled panic. She told me the company was losing money by the minute and begged me to come back, telling me to name my price. I let the silence stretch over the line for a moment, letting her feel the weight of her mistake. I told her I would return as an external consultant, but my fee would be 25% of whatever this outage was currently costing the company. She gasped, calling it extortion. I calmly explained that it was simply the market rate for emergency recovery from a catastrophic infrastructure failure. I told her she could ask any disaster recovery specialist in the state. After a long, agonizing pause, she agreed and told me to get to the office immediately. I did not rush. I took my time, showered, dressed professionally, and drove slowly to the office. When I entered the server room, it was absolute chaos. Technicians were running back and forth, shouting over the hum of the cooling fans, while senior executives hovered near the door like nervous children. The air in the room was hot and dry, smelling of ozone and scorched plastic. The server racks were literally smoking, pushed far beyond their physical limits. I walked to the center of the room and announced that the entire system required an immediate 18-hour shutdown to cool and reset. Victoria went pale, stammering that an 18-hour blackout would cost them millions in lost transactions and client trust. I looked her in the eye and told her it was completely avoidable if she had listened to my warnings. Julian pushed his way through the crowd, his face red with anger. He shouted that my suggestion was ridiculous, claiming they could force a hard reset and bypass the cooling cycle. I stepped close to him, looking down, and told him that if he did so, he would permanently destroy half the company's hardware. I invited him to go ahead if he thought he knew better. The room fell silent. No one moved. Julian looked around, but none of the technicians would meet his eyes. Victoria took a deep breath and told me to do whatever was necessary. For the next several hours, I sat alone in the quiet, darkened server room, watching the temperature gauges slowly drop. I did not waste that time. I connected my laptop to the local admin port and began to document everything. I pulled the system logs, capturing the exact override commands Julian had executed, the warnings the system had generated, and the alerts he had manually dismissed. I compiled the data into a secure folder, ensuring I had undeniable proof of his incompetence. As the servers cooled, I began the gradual process of restarting them, carefully implementing the cycling protocols to bring the core databases back online. The driving rain outside seemed to match the storm brewing within the company's network. As I sat in my armchair, sipping the deep red wine, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I had warned them. I had spent months writing detailed reports about the limits of always-on server loads. I had explained that without the cycling protocol, the internal chips would reach temperatures that would trigger safety shutdowns, or worse, physical degradation. But Julian had dismissed it as technical paranoia. He wanted to show the board that he could squeeze more performance out of the existing infrastructure without spending a dime. Now, his ambition was burning down the very house he wanted to rule. Victoria's call was the ultimate confirmation. Hearing her voice shake, stripped of all its corporate authority, was worth more than any severance package they had denied me. She was a woman who prided herself on control, and now she was completely at the mercy of the man she had discarded just hours before. I knew the servers were currently running at critical levels, the fans screaming as they tried to cool the overheating silicon. The cost of the downtime was compounding by the second, and with every tick of the clock, my value was rising. I took another slow sip of the rich wine, letting the quiet of the night wash over me. In a few hours, the entire executive suite would realize that without my expertise, they were completely helpless. The digital empire they thought they controlled was nothing more than silicon and sand without the proper code. By the time the sun began to set, I had successfully restored about 25% of the affected systems. The critical servers were running stable, but the company was still in a fragile state. The door to the server room creaked open, and Julian slipped inside. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes dark with resentment. He stood near my workstation, accusing me of playing the hero after sabotaging the network to save my career. I did not look up from my screen. I told him that was a serious accusation, reminding him that the cycling protocol failure was documented in 12 separate reports that he was paid to read. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, claiming he had found a remote authentication signature showing I had accessed the network the night before. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart beat a little faster. I explained to him that it was my automated monitoring ping, a standard tool documented in the system specifications. I told him he would know that if he understood the infrastructure. He leaned down, whispering that when this was over, he would make sure I was blacklisted from the entire industry, boasting about his connections. I smiled slightly, telling him it was a bold strategy to threaten the only person currently saving his company. The next morning, I presented a full recovery timeline to Victoria in her office. I estimated it would take 7 days to achieve complete restoration. She looked terrible, with dark circles under her eyes. She told me the board was meeting that afternoon, and they wanted answers. She added that since it was my system, I bore responsibility for the failure as well. I corrected her, stating that my system had operated flawlessly for 10 years and only failed when Julian decided he knew better than the architect who built it. Later that afternoon, I was summoned to the boardroom. 14 executives sat around the long mahogany table, with Victoria and Julian seated at the far end. I was directed to a chair at the opposite end, positioned like an adversary. The board chairman, Gordon Foster, spoke first. He stated they understood I had designed the infrastructure that had failed. I stood up and addressed the board directly. I explained that I had designed an infrastructure that ran without a single minute of unplanned downtime for 10 years. I told them it failed because Julian overrode the core operating principles despite my written warnings. Julian interrupted, arguing that the cycling protocol was outdated and that competitors used always-on systems. I countered immediately, pointing out that those competitors paid double the energy costs and triple the hardware replacement fees. I asked the board if they wanted to spend millions on unnecessary upgrades. A board member asked Julian what it would cost to implement his vision. Julian confidently estimated $8 million for hardware upgrades, plus an additional $3 million in annual operating costs. I turned to the board and stated that restoring my cycling protocol would cost them $0. The room went quiet as the executives processed the numbers. Gordon Foster cleared his throat and asked me to step outside while they deliberated. I stood in the hallway, running the calculations in my head. The outage had already cost the company at least $12 million in lost businesses and client compensation. My 25% consulting fee was already a significant sum, but I knew the crisis was not over. After 45 minutes, the double doors opened and I was called back into the room. Gordon Foster announced they had decided to restore my cycling protocol for now, but wanted to transition to a hybrid system over the next 6 months. He offered me a 6-month contract to oversee the project. I smiled and told him my consulting rate would be triple my previous salary, in addition to the emergency fee. Julian looked furious, but Gordon nodded and slid the contract toward me, stating they valued expertise. The hum of the servers in the dark room was a familiar comfort. For 24 years, this sound had been the background track of my life. I knew every vibration, every pitch change, and what it meant for the health of the system. As the temperature slowly dropped into the safe zone, I felt the satisfaction of a craftsman restoring order to a ruined workshop. Julian's attempt to intimidate me was pathetic. He was a man drowning in his own mistakes, looking for anyone else to pull down with him. The board meeting was a theater of corporate survival. Gordon Foster, the chairman, was a practical man who cared about the bottom line. He did not care about Julian's modern visions or my biomimetic theories. He cared about the $12 million they had lost in a single day. When I showed them the difference between an $8 million hardware upgrade and a $0 software restore, I saw the board members shift. They were not tech experts, but they understood profit and loss. Julian was trying to sell them a gold-plated solution to a problem he had created, while I was offering them their own working system back. Over the next 3 days, I worked almost constantly, restoring systems one by one. But on the 5th day, I walked into my old office and found Julian going through my archived physical files. I asked him if he was looking for something. He jumped, startled, and claimed he was researching for the transition plan. I reminded him those files were outside his access permissions, but he snorted, saying nothing was outside his scope as technology director. I stepped into the room and told him I knew he was looking for evidence of sabotage because he knew the entire disaster landed on his shoulders. His eyes narrowed, and he told me to enjoy my temporary victory, claiming the company would still implement his vision. As he brushed past me, I told him that before this was over, everyone would know exactly who he was. That night, as I reviewed the contract offered by the board, my attorney, Claire Henderson, pointed out a highly suspicious clause regarding intellectual property. She confirmed that the company was attempting to claim complete ownership of my biomimetic computing methodology, not just the local implementation. She explained they wanted to lock me down so I could not take the technology to a competitor, intending to discard me once the transition was fully documented. I thanked her and decided to draft a counteroffer. The next morning, as I waited in the lobby for my meeting with Gordon Foster, my phone buzzed with an email from Victoria's personal account. The subject line read, "What Julian didn't tell you." I opened the attachment and found a series of forwarded emails between Julian and Donald Cross, the chief technology officer of our largest competitor. My jaw tightened as I read the messages. They had been planning this for 8 months. Julian had been feeding internal infrastructure vulnerabilities, client complaints, and roadmaps to Donald Cross. The most damning email was sent 3 days before my termination. Julian had written that once I was removed, they would proceed with Phase 2, disabling the cycling protocol so the system would fail within 48 hours, allowing Donald's team to step in and offer migration services, splitting the commissions 60-40. I immediately forwarded the evidence to my attorney and texted Victoria, telling her to meet me in her office in 10 minutes. When I arrived, Victoria was pacing frantically. She told me she had only discovered the emails that morning while auditing Julian's communications. She confessed she had been blinded by his reports and apologized for firing me. I did not offer her comfort. I told her we were going to meet the board together and that she would present the emails while I presented my contract revisions. We entered the boardroom 10 minutes later. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Victoria connected her laptop and projected the emails onto the large screen. Gasping and angry murmurs erupted from the executives. Gordon Foster's face turned dark. He demanded to know where Julian was, and Victoria replied that security was already escorting him from the premises and that they were preparing to press charges for corporate espionage. I stood up and plugged my flash drive into the system. I told the board there was more. I showed them logs proving that during my recovery efforts, I discovered my adaptive infrastructure had automatically blocked 4 major cyber attacks over the past year. I explained that these security features were part of my proprietary biomimetic methodology, which I had never fully documented because they were still being refined. I distributed copies of my revised contract. The conspiracy between Julian and Donald Cross was the final piece of the puzzle. It explained why Julian had been so desperate to remove me. It was not just ego, it was a calculated heist. He wanted to crash the system, blame it on my outdated architecture, and then pretend to save the company by migrating the clients to Donald's network, taking a massive cut of the fees. It was a breach of fiduciary duty so severe that it crossed into criminal activity. My attorney, Claire Henderson, was already preparing the legal paperwork. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Julian's deliberate override of the safety systems to cause damage constituted unauthorized access to a protected computer. We had the emails, the system logs, and the authentication records. We had everything we needed to destroy him. My attorney, Claire Henderson, pointed out that we also had grounds for a massive civil suit against Donald Cross's firm for tortious interference with business relations. We had Julian's communications detailing exactly how they planned to divide the stolen client base. When I walked into the boardroom with Victoria, I felt a cold calm. I was no longer just an employee fighting for his job. I was the prosecutor presenting an open and shut case. The board members, who had looked at me with suspicion the day before, now looked at Julian with pure fury. They realized that their trusted director had been trying to burn their company down from the inside. The board members read the terms in stunned silence. Gordon Foster looked up, stating that my demands were unprecedented. I had laid out 5 strict conditions: full ownership of my biomimetic computing intellectual property, with the company receiving a non-exclusive license, the creation of a new Chief Innovation Officer position reporting directly to the board, a 12% royalty on all current and future implementations, public recognition as the creator of the technology, and a permanent seat on the board of directors. One executive accused me of leveraging their crisis for personal gain. I looked him in the eye and told him I was establishing fair value for the innovations that had saved the company twice, once from external hackers and once from internal sabotage. I reminded them that my technology was worth millions. The negotiations lasted for 5 exhausting hours. Executives argued, threats were made, and lawyers were consulted, but I stood my ground. By late afternoon, we had a signed agreement. I secured my officer position, my intellectual property rights, and my board seat. Victoria survived the fallout but was demoted to regional operations, accepting her reduced role with surprising humility. The following months brought massive change. Julian faced federal criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the Economic Espionage Act, his career utterly ruined. Several clients who had been approached by Donald Cross's firm came forward, strengthening the legal case against both of them. I hired a new team of talented engineers and expanded the biomimetic platform, securing partnerships with 4 Fortune 100 companies eager to adopt our self-healing, energy-efficient systems. The company's stock price soared to record heights. 8 months later, I stood on the grand stage at the National Technology Summit, holding the Innovation Impact Award. The applause from the audience was deafening. I looked out at the crowd, spotting Gordon Foster and the other board members smiling proudly in the front row, while Victoria sat further back, watching quietly. I spoke into the microphone, explaining that the natural world offers profound lessons for technological design. I told the audience that systems that rest and regenerate are not inefficient. They are resilient and sustainable. I concluded my speech by sharing the philosophy that had guided me through the betrayal. Innovation does not fear disruption. It anticipates it. My systems expect failure and grow stronger from it. What I did not tell the audience was how perfectly that principle had applied to my own life. In attempting to render me obsolete, Julian, Victoria, and the board had created the exact conditions for my greatest triumph. They had tried to push me out, but instead, they had made themselves obsolete. Now, they worked to implement my vision. As I walked off the stage, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert from my monitoring network. The competitor company, where Donald Cross was still struggling to manage his clients, was currently experiencing a massive, cascading system failure. I smiled and slid the phone back into my pocket. Sometimes, the systems we build deliver justice all on their own. The transition was smooth, but the structural lessons we forced the company to learn were permanent. The company survived, but the power dynamic had shifted completely, never to return. I was no longer the quiet technician in the basement server room. I was now the chief innovation officer, a member of the board, and the owner of the intellectual property that kept the entire enterprise running. Julian's federal prosecution was a quiet but devastating affair, sending shockwaves through the tech community. Facing federal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, his professional career was utterly ruined. Several clients approached by Donald Cross's firm came forward, reinforcing the legal case against them. Donald Cross was fired in disgrace from his competitor firm, which was now scrambling to avoid being named as a co-conspirator. I assembled a brand new team of engineers who understood my biomimetic vision. We expanded the computing platform, applying its principles to new domains like decentralized database management and cloud network security. The stock price soared as we announced partnerships with 4 Fortune 100 companies eager to implement our energy-efficient systems. 8 months later, I stood on stage at the National Technology Summit, accepting the Innovation Impact Award. The applause was deafening. I looked out at the crowd, spotting Gordon Foster and the other board members smiling proudly, while Victoria sat further back, watching quietly. I spoke into the microphone, explaining that the natural world offers profound lessons for technological design. I told the audience that systems that rest and regenerate are not inefficient, they are resilient and sustainable. I concluded my speech by sharing the philosophy that had guided me. Innovation does not fear disruption, it anticipates it. My systems expect failure and grow stronger. What I did not say was how perfectly that it applied to my life. In attempting to render me obsolete, Julian, Victoria, and the board had created the conditions for my triumph. They tried to push me out, but made themselves obsolete. Now, they worked to implement my vision. As I walked off the stage, my phone buzzed. It was an alert from my monitoring network. The competitor company, where Donald Cross was struggling, was experiencing a massive cascading system failure. I smiled and slid the phone back into my pocket. Sometimes, the systems we build deliver justice all on their own, proving that patience and precision outlast political ambition.